Hello and warm greetings. Welcome to the Analyst by Vajiram and Ravi, where we would try to comprehensively analyze 7 articles in 2 different sections. In the analysis part, we'll first have a look at the need of having a grand strategy for India's foreign policy so as to elevate its status as a global power. Then, in the second article, we'll have a look at the disruptions in the Indian Parliament, the causes, and the way forward. Then, in the simplified section, we'll have a look at 5 different articles from a special perspective of UPSC Prelims 2025 along with the value addition. So stay tuned. Now, before starting today's discussion, on behalf of Vajiram and Ravi, let me wish you all a very happy and fulfilling new year. May all your dreams come true and may you all qualify a civil service exam with flying colors. So let's start the discussion. And the first article is the grand strategy for India's foreign policy. See, we have this column which is written by the international affairs expert Suhasini Heather. It's basically a book review of 3 books. We have the first book as Friends, the second as The Unfinished Quest, and the third is the Vishwa Shastra. Now, see, what the review tries to tell us is that all these 3 books, they basically talk about the evolution of India's foreign policy and the ways, the measures needed to achieve the status of global power, right? One of the very important principles which has been highlighted in all these 3 books is the principle of strategic autonomy. So we'll have a discussion with respect to what that principle is, how the evolution of Indian foreign policy has taken place, and what measures are needed. Now, this is with respect to GSU, international relations. Now, before we discuss the evolution of India's foreign policy, let us first talk about a very important concept in international relations, and that is world order. What do we mean by world order? See, it basically implies the distribution of power and authority among different countries. That is, at a particular moment, how is the power and authority distributed among different countries around the world? Now, if you look at this infographic, what you will see is that just before 2-3 centuries, we had the Dutch who had a sort of a dominance, primarily on the basis of their naval superiority. Then that was overtaken by the Britishers at the start of the Industrial Revolution till the end of Second World War. And then what we saw was the emergence of US power. And now, especially after 2001, what we are witnessing is the aggressive rise of China. That is what the world order is all about. Now, we have to study the Indian foreign policy looking at the kind of changes we had in the world order, right? Now, as I told in the beginning, that one of the very important principles which we have followed is the principle of strategic autonomy. Now, how you define the principle of strategic autonomy? See, it basically implies the ability of a state to pursue its own national interests and its own preferred foreign policy choices without being constrained by the other states. That is, you are basically following a particular course of action which is based upon the national interest, and that is not being constrained by the others. Now, what it implies in India's construct is primarily 2 things. First is securing the territorial integrity. Second is securing the sovereignty, both internal and external. Now, why is the strategic autonomy important for a country like India? Why we give so much of emphasis on the strategic autonomy? See, the reason is that we were ruled by the Britishers, and the Britishers exploited the country to the very possible extent. Now, again, that is the reason that we give a lot of importance to these principles of non-interference, to these principles of autonomy. And therefore, this particular principle of strategic autonomy becomes really important in India's overall India's foreign policy. Now, let's first talk about how the evolution of India's foreign policy has taken place. So if we look at the first phase, which started at the time of the independence till 1961, that was a phase of non-alignment. As the word says, that India said that we will not be aligned to a particular country. Now, you need to understand the kind of context which was there at this particular moment of time. That was the bipolar world. So we had sort of the world being run by 2 power blocks. We had the one power block led by the US and the other led by the Soviet Union. Again, it was the effort of India and other countries which led to the institutionalization of the non-aligned movement. And then what we also saw was the emphasis of India on the Panchsheel policy. Now, what is this Panchsheel policy? This was primarily in the context of India's relation with China, and it basically tried to showcase the kind of principles of peaceful existence. Next is preservation of autonomy. What we are trying to say is that it was during this phase that India tried to basically consolidate its territorial integrity, right? And therefore, all of its foreign policy actions were based upon the sole objective of preserving the territorial integrity. The second phase starts with 1962. That is after the Sino-India War, where unfortunately India witnessed the defeat. Now again, from 1962 till 1971, we had this phase of realism. Now, what we are trying to say is that this was a phase where we gave importance to pragmatic choices. That is, we basically gave importance to practical realities rather than having the dependence on idealism, right? Again, the example which we can quote is that India entered into a particular defense arrangement with the US during these years. Next phase, the third phase, is of regional assertion. That is, India tried to showcase its regional power, starting from 1971 till 1991. How was it visible? Now, this was visible in the kind of tilt we had towards the USSR. And we signed the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Peace with Soviet Union. Next is that India played a very important role when we talk about the creation of Bangladesh. The next thing was the nuclear test of 1974. Popularly known as the Smiling Buddha. Now, this established its dominance as a nuclear power. And after this, what happened was that India was actually subjected to a lot of Western sanctions. Next is, we also participated in the peacekeeping operations. You must have heard about the India Peacekeeping Forces, IPKF, in Sri Lanka, right? Next is the US-China-Pakistan axis. Now, what you must understand is that as India began its tilt towards the USSR, there was a development of a sort of an axis that was US, China and Pakistan. This was primarily a sort of an axis which was against India, right? And therefore, India faced a lot of difficulties in becoming a regional power. Next phase is that of the witnessing of the start of the strategic autonomy, right? So this primarily started in 1991 and it continued till 2005. Now, what you need to understand is that 1991 is a landmark year when we talk about the global politics. The first is that we had the disintegration of the USSR. And then second, what we saw was the unipolarity of the US. And the third, we also saw there were a lot of disturbances in the West Asia, that is the Gulf War. And the fourth point is that we also saw the economic reforms being taken in India, right? What we call as the LPG reforms. Now, what you need to understand is that on the basis of these economic reforms, there was a change in India's foreign policy choices, right? And that was visible in India's greater interactions with the US. Next is it started multi-alignment. Now, what do we mean by that? It was during this phase that India started to have relations with other parts of the world, be it relations with Israel, be it relations with the Southeast Asian countries, right? So we started a very important foreign policy initiative that is Look East, right? So these were the kind of events which we witnessed. Next phase, what we have is the fifth phase. Now this is a kind of strategic autonomy in a multipolar world, which continues to the present day. Now there have been a lot of events which basically signify the kind of autonomy which India is exercising in its foreign policy choices. The very first is a shift from a P2 mindset. That is, now, see, again, initially we used to look at things from that angle, from the permanent two, that is US and China. Now we are witnessing a kind of approach where we are also giving importance to the other countries around the world. Next is the focus upon the Indo-Pacific. Now understand that there has been a shift when we talk about the power shift taking place from the Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific. And in the Indo-Pacific region, we have the Indian Ocean region, which is the most important. And therefore, India is trying to be a leader, a regional leader in this particular region. And that is the reason that we focus a lot upon having a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific. Next is the balancing diplomacy. That is, we are having a kind of relations where we are having relations with China and Russia on one side, and on the other, we are having relations with the other countries, be it the Western powers or the US, right? So we are trying to have a kind of a balanced relationship. Next is the focus upon de-hyphenation. Now, what do we mean by that? It primarily implies that when we are looking at different countries, we are compartmentalizing the relations. We are not mixing up things. Take the case of India's relation with Israel, or take the case of India's relation with Palestine. Both stand on its own merit, right? Next is the issue-based cooperation. When we are talking about the issue-based cooperation, what we are trying to say is that India has basically come into partnerships with different countries around the world. Be it the African countries, what we call as the South-South cooperation, or be it with the interactions with the different middle powers. So we are having a kind of issue-based cooperation, be it climate change, be it the reforms which we need in the WTO, Next is intensified cooperation with the middle powers. Now again, we have the middle powers like Germany, Japan, South Korea. Now these countries are technologically very rich, right? So we are trying to have a partnership with them so that we can have adequate technology transfer and we can benefit. Next is the kind of defense deal we are having. See, you must understand that the US declared India as a major defense partner in the year 2016. And at the same time, we are also having very good defense relations with Russia, which is visible in the form of the kind of S-400 Triumph missile system, right, which we are procuring from the Russia. Next is the 2+2 dialogue. Now, why we are trying to emphasize upon this is that this is a very important strategic initiative where we are involving the foreign and the defense ministers of the two countries, the participating countries. Now, India has come up with a kind of 2+2 dialogue with 4 countries. We have US, we have Japan, we have Australia, and you need to tell me which is the 4th country, right? So we have come into a 2+2 kind of dialogue where we are giving importance to these aspects of military, defense, foreign affairs cumulatively, right? Next is the military logistics agreements. What we're trying to say is that India has come with strategic partnerships in the kind of military domain when we talk about the logistics arrangement. For example, we have got LEMOA with the US. For example, we have with the RELOS. We have got the RELOS with Russia. We have logistics agreement with France. We have it with Singapore. Next is that India pulled out itself of RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Now, what you need to understand is that it is primarily a China-led initiative, right? Now, there were concerns associated with it because what we were seeing is that if India were a part of RCEP, it would have been subjected to a lot of impositions by China. So we basically came out of that. Second reason was that we saw ourselves as sort of vulnerable when we talk about the domestic manufacturers in India, right? So that was the reason we came out from RCEP. Next is use of hard power. It's not that India has not been using the hard power. Take the case of surgical strikes in Pakistan or take the case of surgical strikes in Myanmar, right? So we have been using that. Next is expanding the soft power, very important. So we have been focusing upon the events like International Yoga Day, or we have been focusing upon International Solar Alliance, or we have established the South Asian universities. Again, we are trying to show that India has a lot of its soft power and we are trying to capitalize upon that. Next is from balancing power to a leading power. Now, these are the words of the Minister for External Affairs, Dr. S. Jaishankar, who says that India has transitioned itself from a balancing power to a leading power in the world. So this is the kind of structure we have till now. Now, what are the challenges to this kind of strategic autonomy which we are actually practicing? The very first is perception of weakness. See, please understand that if a country wants to be a global power, it has to basically take a stand on particular international issue. But what different countries have been alleging is that India has been having a sort of a sitting on the fence approach. That is, it has not taken a kind of firm decisions when we talk about some of the very important international issues. Be it the atrocities being committed by the Myanmarese Janta on its citizens, or be it the Russian atrocities on the Ukraine, right? So therefore, what we see is that different countries feel that this is a kind of a perception of weakness. Next is fear of becoming a US ally. Again, what we are trying to say is that US has always seen this principle of strategic autonomy in a very negative way. It has said that this is a kind of approach which should not be taken by India, right? And again, what it has been doing is it is trying to restrict the choices for India, be it the sanctions on the Iranian oil supplies, or be it its concerns associated with the kind of imports we are having, the defense imports we are having from Russia, right? So again, it restricts India's choices. Next is the assertive rise of China. Now, when we are talking about the assertive rise of China, we are primarily talking about the land borders. So we have been facing a lot of skirmishes, standoffs at the border, and that basically what it makes India to do is to tilt towards the Western power. So therefore, it harms the principle of strategic autonomy. Next is the assertion of power. When we are talking about the regional dominance in the Indian Ocean region, when India says that it is basically a net security provider in the Indian Ocean region, we have to invest a lot in the military aspect, right? And that can lead to a possible confrontation, right? Next is dependence on other developed countries. Please understand, India is still a lot of dependent when we talk about these developed countries for technology, be it the critical defense supplies from the US, or be it the other transfers from Japan or Australia, right? So again, we are dependent on these countries, and therefore it is basically something which goes against the principle of strategic autonomy. Now, what should be the way forward? The very first is that India should have a multi-vector foreign policy approach. That is, we need to come up with sort of having relations with different countries around the world. We should not restrict ourselves. We should come up with different strategic partnerships with different countries on its own merit. Next is creative diplomacy and flexibility. We need to invest a lot when we talk about the diplomatic aspect, when we talk about the diplomatic capital. So when we compare our diplomacy with that of the China, we are very far from it, right? So therefore, we have to adequately invest so that we can have the diplomatic maneuvering when we are talking to different countries around the world. Next is cooperate and compete. Now, this is very important. It's not just about cooperation. It's also about competing with other countries, having that spirit of competition so that we also become a leader in some of these technologies. Next is active engagement with middle powers. Very important. Be it Germany, be it Japan, be it South Korea. We need to come up with strategic arrangements with these countries so that we can get benefit in some of these technologies where these countries are centers of power, right? Next is utilizing the multilateral institutions. Very important. Take the case of United Nations General Assembly or take the case of World Trade Organizations. We need to basically utilize these platforms. Say that we can come in partnerships with different African countries and then put up that particular agenda on that flow, and so that we can basically gather the kind of support which is needed for these reforms. Now again, what we're trying to say is that definitely India is having this particular stance of strategic autonomy, but what is really needed is that India needs to invest a lot upon its military and economic preparedness. We need to be economically very strong. We need to be militarily very strong so that in real sense we can exercise this aspect of strategic autonomy. So we can basically go with these approaches and make sure that we utilize the strategic autonomy in the best of India's interest. Now, see, we have this particular book review. Now, this can be really important for those who are having the PSIR as an optional. I'll just try to summarize it very quickly. See, we have got these three books. The first is Friends, written by Sriram Chaulia. Next, we have The Unfinished Quest, written by T.V. Paul. And third, we have Vishwa Shastra, written by Dhruv Jaishankar. Now, again, what this particular first book talks about is that we need to focus upon having kind of bilateral relationships more than the multilateral frameworks. So what Sriram Chaulia says that India needs to come up with different bilateral partnerships and use these partnerships for countering the Chinese dominance. The second book, which is written by T.V. Paul, says that it basically talks about the India's evolution from independence to its quest for global power status, and says that India should capitalize upon its soft power, but should basically also follow the kind of liberal ethos it has. Next is T.V. Paul says that India has not focused a lot upon its South Asian partners, right? Next is Vishwa Shastra, written by Dhruv Jaishankar, son of the Minister for External Affairs, Dr. S. Jaishankar. Now, he says that the turning point in India's foreign policy has been the year 1991, when it witnessed the LPG reforms, the Gulf War was taking place, the US unipolarity was there, right? Next, what he says that what the priority for India should be is to manage China, strengthen the Quad and deepen its ties with its neighbors. Next is that it should have a kind of a very distinct approach when we talk about Pakistan. Finally, what you need to understand is when we talk about these two books, Friends and The Unfinished Quest, what is similar in these two books is that they are basically focusing upon having international partnerships. But when we talk about Vishwa Shastra, it is primarily focusing upon the regional dynamics. Next aspect, which is common in all these three books, is that how to counter the rise of China. And that is where all the three writers say that the biggest challenge to India's foreign policy is the rise and aggression of China. So that is it, what you need to know. Let's talk about a mains practice question. The question says, India's foreign policy has traditionally been guided by the principle of strategic autonomy, reflecting its desire to maintain independence in decision making while balancing partnerships with global powers. Discuss how strategic autonomy can be effectively integrated into this strategy to achieve India's aspirations as a global power. 15 marks, 250 words. Do write a particular answer on this question. Now, coming to the next article, this is with respect to the decline in the parliamentary functioning in India. Now, we have a column written by Mr. Shashi Tharoor, who basically highlights the increasing instances of walkouts, of disruptions taking place on the floor of the House, frequent adjournments. Now, this is something really bad for a country like India, which has a representative democracy, right? And we call Parliament as a temple of democracy. So this is something which is of serious concern. Now, we will see what are the different causes, what can be the way forward. Now, this is with respect to GS2 Parliament. Now, see, we have the Parliament, which is the supreme lawmaking institution in the country, right? vested with a lot of power and prestige. So what are basically the most important functions of Parliament? The very first is legislation. That is, it is responsible for framing the laws, including making changes in the constitution. Next is representation. See, we have people who are elected by the masses of the country and they represent their views on the floor of the house. So basically they represent their interest. Next is deliberation. When we talk about the Parliament, it is the most important platform of having deliberations on some of the very important national issues. Next is accountability, very important. Now, when we are talking about accountability, what we are trying to say is that India is a parliamentary democracy where the executive is basically accountable to the legislature, right? And therefore, what we have, the Parliament, is that adequate accountability of the executive is maintained through the institution of Parliament. Now, what do we mean by the decline in parliamentary functioning? What it means is the kind of erosion of the role, of the effectiveness and significance of the Parliament with respect to these constitutionally mandated responsibilities. That is, with respect to the legislation, with respect to the representation, with respect to the deliberation aspect, with respect to the accountability of the executive. Now, what are the indicators of the decline in the parliamentary functioning? The very first is decline in the legislative output. Now, what we are trying to say is that the number of the deliberations or the quality of the deliberations which are taking place on the floor of the house, they are actually reducing. So if you just look at the 16th Lok Sabha, almost 180 laws were passed, right? But out of these 180 laws, 25% of the bills did not have any kind of detailed scrutiny, right? Now, all the data which I have put here is from the PRS legislative research. Now, again, for the very important legislations like the farm laws or the repeal of Article 370, minimal discussions took place on the floor of the House. Next is reduction in the parliamentary sessions. What we are trying to say is, with time, the number of meetings have consistently reduced in the Parliament. So it meets less frequently. For example, in 1950s, the Parliament met on an annual basis for almost 120 days. But in 2021, this reduced to just 58 days. Now, if the number of meetings, if the number of days for which the Parliament is meeting is less, obviously it would limit the meaningful debates in the Parliament. Next is frequent disruptions. What we are witnessing, and as also the author talks about, that there have been greater instances of walkouts, of adjournments. Next is that the monsoon session of 2021, it witnessed a productivity of just 22% for Lok Sabha and 28% for Rajya Sabha. Just look at this. Around 1/4 of the total productivity was witnessed. Next is rise in executive dominance. What we are trying to say is, in a parliamentary democracy, we have the executive, which is accountable to the legislature. But what we are witnessing is, on the basis of the sheer support of majority in the parliament, we have been witnessing a kind of majority dominating in the overall parliamentary works, right? Also, what we are seeing is that there has been a greater reliance on the ordinance route. See, again, the constitution has provided for this route, the ordinance route, but only for emergency situations, not for ordinary situations. But what we have been seeing is that the executive is more and more relying on this ordinance route. For example, the Tribunal Reforms Ordinance of 2021, it was passed through this particular route. Next is inadequate scrutiny of bills. See, we have this concept of departmentally related standing committees, which are one more instrument to basically ensure the accountability of the executive. But again, these institutions, these committees, they remain underutilized. And if I were to give you the data, what it says is that almost 71% of the bills were referred to these DRSCs in 15th Lok Sabha, but only 25% of the bills went to these committees. Next is misuse of money bill provisions. See, again, when we talk about the money bill aspect, what we're trying to say is that this is a way in which you can bypass the Rajya Sabha. And there have been instances where certain key bills, for example, the Aadhaar Act, was passed as a money bill having a lot of implications, right? So a petition was also submitted into the Supreme Court. So again, more and more, the government is relying on these money bill aspect. Next is weakening of the question hour. Question hour is one of the mechanisms to ensure that there is proper accountability of the executive. But what we are seeing is that the government has been reducing the scope of the usage of the question hour. For example, during the COVID-19 times, the question hour was completely suspended. Next is partisan politics and lack of consensus. See, again, having different political parties is a sign of mature democracies, is a sign of having a lot of different views on the developmental aspects. But what we are witnessing in India is that there has been too much of polarization when we talk about the politics going on. We are not having a kind of politics based on the development. We are having politics based on the parties, right? And that has led to a great polarization. And also we have some of the very contentious acts being passed by the parliament. For example, the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019. Again, it has been passed by the parliament, but it basically had a lot of socio-economic implications, right? They are being passed with limited deliberations. Now, what are the causes of the decline in the overall parliamentary functioning? The very first is hyper-partisanship. What the author of the article says, that we also had the times when we had some of the leaders in the opposition, for example, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and he had very good sort of relations with Nehru, right? They had their own different opinions, but it was a kind of very good culture which was there. But right now what we are seeing is that there has been hyper-partisanship. Politics is now based upon the party interests and not on development, right? And it has led to the polarization of the environment. Next is over-centralization. What we are saying is that because on the basis of the sheer majority in the parliament, the executive is sidelining the legislature, which is obviously not good for a parliamentary democracy. Next is weak institutional frameworks. What we have also been witnessing is that the chair of the house, be it the speaker of the Lok Sabha or be it the chairman of the Rajya Sabha, there have been allegations that they are not following the principles of impartiality. They are actually biased. Next is resource constraint. When we talk about the members of parliament, they do not have the adequate resource to basically invest upon the research for a particular policy initiative and come out with their response. Next is public disengagement. What we are trying to say is that there has been a limited public pressure, primarily because of the lack of consultations with the public, right? Next is structural issues. What we are trying to say is parliament as a body has a lot of tasks to do, right? But because of the restrictions on the number of days it is meeting, right? Because of the other constraints, it has not been able to fulfill the agenda. And because of that, what we are seeing is that the overall aspect is that it is overburdened, right? Now, what are the consequences of the decline in the overall functioning of the parliament? The very first is weakening of the checks and balance. See, what we are saying is that in a parliamentary democracy, the executive is accountable to the parliament. But just on the basis of a sheer majority in the parliament, there has been a lack of oversight by the parliament on the executive, which is obviously not good. Next is diminished representation. What we are trying to say? We are saying that if you will have less number of debates and discussions taking place on the floor of the house, obviously it would lead to a sort of less representation of different regions, of different sections of the society on the floor of the house. Next is erosion of trust in the institutions. When we talk about the parliament, it's a supreme lawmaking institution. It's a temple of the democracy. But again, if you witness such kind of events again and again taking place in the parliament, obviously it leads to the erosion of trust of people in these institutions. Poor quality of legislation. If you will have less debates taking place, less deliberations, less scrutiny taking place, there would be issues in the implementation of different laws. There would be legal issues, right? So that is obviously not good. Next is reduced global standing. What we are trying to say is that for a democracy like India, it is not good to see such instances happening in the parliament. We have evolved into a kind of democracy where we give sort of representation to different sections of the society. So obviously, once you see such kind of instances, that does not give a good impression about the overall parliamentary functioning. Now, what are the suggestions for revitalizing the legislature? We have the first is increasing the parliamentary sitting days. We have the National Commission to Review the Working of the Constitution, which says that there should be a mandatory attendance of almost 120 days a year in the parliament. Next is strengthen the committee system so as to make sure that there is proper detailed scrutiny. There is a stakeholder consultation for every bill which we are having in the parliament, right? Mandatory referral for all the major bills, better resources and transparency. Be it the basic necessities, the research stuff should be given to these committees. Next is curb the disruptions. There should be strict rules for maintaining order and decorum in the house. And if a member is not abiding by that, there have to be strict penalties. Next is revive the private members bill. Very important. It should not be just the government who is coming on the floor of the house with new bills. What there should be is that adequate emphasis should also be given to these private members who can come up with their own suggestions in the form of new bills. Focus on capacity building. What we are trying to say is that these different member of parliament should be given adequate resources so that they can basically have their own research stuff. They can basically work upon a policy aspect and then give suggestions on the floor of the house, right? Equip the MPs with research, support and training. Anti-defection law reforms, very important. We have the anti-defection law. Now this has basically made different member of parliament to restrict from expressing their opinions, right? So there have to be reforms in the anti-defection so that they can have greater freedoms. The member of parliaments can have greater freedoms to express their dissent. Next is public engagement, very important. We should adequately focus upon public hearings and transparent legislative processes. Adequate public consultation should be there so that the views of the public, the interests of the public, the genuine interests can be integrated into the overall framing of the laws. Again, what we are saying is that these frequent disruptions, it is obviously not good for a country like India, and there have to be adequate steps which should be taken. We have these recommendations by the National Commission to review the working of the Constitution and other steps which should be taken so as to evolve into a kind of scenario where the discussions taking place in the Parliament are more productive and in the national interest. So this is what you need to know with respect to this article. Let's have a mains practice question. The question says, the declining effectiveness of the Indian Parliament has raised concerns about its ability to fulfill its constitutional responsibilities. Critically analyze the factors contributing to this parliamentary decline and suggest measures to revitalize the Parliament's role as a cornerstone of India's democracy. 15 marks, 250 words. Do write a particular answer on this question. Now, coming to the simplified section, we have the first article as the excessive contamination of the groundwater. Now, in this article, the gist of the article is that we have a particular report by the Central Groundwater Board. Now, the report says that there has been increasing instances of excessive contamination of the groundwater when we talk about the nitrate contamination, when we talk about the fluoride contamination, and when we talk about the uranium contamination. Now, see, this article is quite data intensive in nature. There's not much of concept which is involved, but that data can be really helpful once we are talking about the prelims exam or the mains exam. Second aspect is that we'll also look into the health impacts and the economic impacts of these contamination. So let's talk about the article. The article says excessive nitrates have been found in 440 districts as of 2023, increase from 359 such districts in 2017. A report has been published by Central Groundwater Board. Now, this is primarily a health hazard, especially for the young children, and a source of environmental toxicity. 56% of India's districts have excessive nitrates. Very important data, can be used in your mains answer as well. Which is actually defined as more than 45 milligrams per liter in the groundwater due to the use of subsidized synthetic nitrogenous fertilizers. See, one of the negative implications of the Green Revolution, we have been increasing the usage of the fertilizers, chemical fertilizers, and that has led to an increase in the nitrate contamination. Of the 15,239 groundwater samples across the country, 19.8% had nitrates or nitrogen compounds above the safe limits. In the 13,028 samples analyzed in 2017, 21.6 had excessive nitrates. Rajasthan, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu reported the highest nitrate contamination problem. Just remember these states, Rajasthan, Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, with having the percentage as 49%, 48%, 37% respectively. Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh and Gujarat have a long-standing nitrate problem. However, regions in central and southern India are reporting an increasing trend. What we are trying to say is, it's not just these conventional states which had a problem of nitrate contamination. We are also witnessing this problem in newer states. Next is Maharashtra, Telangana and Andhra Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh also show notable levels of nitrate contamination, growing a concern in the central southern regions. The monsoon rain tends to increase the nitrate levels primarily because of the leaching of the water, right? With 30.77% of the samples contaminated in the pre-monsoon period, compared with 32.6% after the rainy season. So it's but obvious, once you'll have rain, that nitrates would leach down into the groundwater, and obviously the amount of nitrate would increase. Other major chemical contaminants affecting the groundwater quality are the fluoride and uranium. Fluoride concentrations are a major concern in the states like Rajasthan, Haryana, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. Rajasthan and Punjab reported the highest number of samples with uranium contamination concentration exceeding 100 parts per billion. Anything over 30 parts per billion of the uranium is considered unsafe, and several of these samples were predominant in the regions of Rajasthan, Gujarat, Haryana, Punjab, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, where the groundwater is being overexploited with more water being drawn than being replenished by rain or other means. In the other report, what the Central Groundwater Board has said, it talks about the availability of the groundwater across India. What it says is that it has estimated that on the whole, the stage of groundwater extraction across the country is 60.4%, roughly the same it has been since 2009. About 73% of the blocks analyzed for the groundwater levels are in safe zone, meaning that they are replenished enough to compensate for the water drawn out. This data can be important. You can have a look. Now, let's talk about these contamination. See, there have been questions in the UPSC where you have these contamination on one side and the disease on the other. So for that, I have given this information. We have got the nitrate contamination where we have the disease known as the blue baby syndrome. In this particular disease, what happens is that you have the high nitrate levels. They interfere with the oxygen carrying capacity of the bloods in the children, in the infants. Next, you have the increased risk of gastric cancer and other gastrointestinal disorders. Then nitrate reacts with the amines in the human body and it leads to the formation of nitrosamines, which are carcinogenic in nature, that is cancer causing. What are the environmental impacts? Very simple. We have got the eutrophication. So when excessive amounts of nitrate enters into the water bodies, it leads to the formation of algal blooms and aquatic ecosystem disruptions. Then it also leads to the loss of biodiversity because you have a lot of fishes and other aquatic living organisms who die because of this contamination, eutrophication. Next, we have got fluoride contamination. Primarily, what you have is a kind of fluorosis, which is one is dental fluorosis, the other is skeletal. It primarily affects the sort of the calcium, amount of calcium in the body, and therefore sometimes it leads to discoloration of the teeth. And in the skeletal fluorosis, what it does is it leads to the weakening of the bones, joint pains and stiffness, and in some extreme cases it leads to the immobility. Also, what we can have is neurological problems with developmental delays in children. Then agricultural impact, the fluoride accumulation in the soil, it reduces the crop yields and affects the food safety. Next is uranium contamination. We have one of the very important negative implications, and that is the kidney damage. Uranium is nephrotoxic and causes chronic kidney disease, CKD. Increased risk of lung and bone cancer due to radioactive decay of the uranium isotopes. Developmental issues in children such as lower intelligence quotient and growth delays. Potential genetic mutations and birth defects. What are the environmental impacts? Radioactive contamination of the soil and water, posing long-term risks to the ecosystems. Then there are challenges in the safe disposal of uranium-rich sludge from water treatment processes. So this you should understand because this information can be important once you are solving a particular prelims question. That is what you need to know with respect to this article. Now coming to the next article, this is with respect to the space docking experiment and Bhartiya Antariksh station. So the gist of the article is that recently we had a polar satellite launch vehicle. Now this placed 2 satellites in the orbit. Now what they'll primarily do is that they will connect to each other, what we call as a rendezvous, and then they will basically dock with each other. That is a very important step when we talk about the ISRO's future mission, be it Chandrayaan 4 or be it the Bhartiya Antariksh station. So that is in that context we have this particular article. So there will be a series of space docking experiment before the Indian Space Research Organization embarks on the Chandrayaan 4. Now Chandrayaan 4 is a follow-up mission to Chandrayaan 3. Now this would basically involve lunar mapping, right? And also it would involve in situ instruments exploring the surface of moon, right? Mission to bring soil samples from the moon to the earth, the ISRO has said. On Monday, the C-60 mission of the Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle placed 2 satellites, each weighing 220 kg in the orbit. They will rendezvous and dock with each other as a part of ISRO's first space docking experiment. Again, understand, you have placed 2 satellites in the orbit. Slowly, they would come close, they would connect, and that is what we call space rendezvous, right? And then we'll have the docking experiment. The 2 SpaDeX satellites have moved one behind the other. So over a period of time, they'll pick up further distance. The distance will increase by 20 kilometers over the next few days. And then the rendezvous and the docking process will start. Docking is, now why is docking important? Docking is a crucial technology for India to master for the Chandrayaan 4 as well as for the forthcoming Bhartiya Antariksh station, expected to be ready by 2035 and for its goal to send Indian astronaut to the moon. Docking is important for all future missions of the ISRO because you cannot launch everything in one go. So you need docking of modules in the space. Again, understand, if India wants to have international space station, its own space station in the orbit, so it will have to send the kind of different modules again and again, right? And then once you will have different modules, they would dock, they would connect to each other. That is why the docking experiment are very important. There will be 5 modules in the Bhartiya Antariksh station, all of which require docking. This technology is crucial for bringing back the lunar soil samples and for India's constant presence in the space. The 2 satellites in the current mission are in the circular orbit, 475 kilometers above the Earth. At that height, the 2 satellites will be moving at a speed of 28,000 kilometers per hour. Can you just imagine, at this speed, they will perform this docking experiment, right? To bring them together, you have to match their speeds. It's not easy to match and adjust their speeds precisely, making them come close to each other and then dock. So this is a very technologically intensive task, right? Very sophisticated task. Now, let's talk about the experiment. We've just talked about it, but let's talk in detail. So it's a maiden attempt to demonstrate the autonomous docking technology, a critical capability for future space missions, be it Chandrayaan-4 or be it Bhartiya Antariksh station. Envisioned by the Indian Space Research Organization to enable the space station construction, satellite servicing and on-orbit fuel transfer. Features comprise of two small spacecraft. We have one, the Chaser, and then we have got a Target. We'll test the proximity operations, rendezvous, and docking technologies. Significance, now this would be a stepping stone towards India's manned and unmanned missions requiring modular structure or assembly in space. Advances in India's technical expertise for future collaborative or independent space stations mission. Now, let's talk about the Bhartiya Antariksh station. So this is India's indigenous low Earth orbit space station, which is proposed by the Indian Space Research Organization, envisaged as a modular structure for conducting experiments in microgravity, life sciences, material sciences, and fundamental physics. We have the International Space Station, which is a collaborative work of NASA and other space agencies. Similarly, what we are trying to have is our own sort of space station in the form of Bhartiya Antariksh station. Features, it is smaller compared to the International Space Station, operational altitude around 400 km. Crew capacity can accommodate 3 to 4 astronauts for short duration, almost 20 days, initially designed with research and habitation modules expandable over time, along with the docking experiments. Enables India's sustained presence in the space, enhancing its global stature. Boosts India's capability for long duration space missions, critical for interplanetary explorations. Also, for example, we have the Chandrayaan-4, where you will have particular instruments going there on the lunar surface and then bringing the soil samples, right? So in such kind of missions, this becomes really important. Expected deployment by 2030s as a part of ISRO's long-term goals following the success of Gaganyaan mission. So this is what you need to know with respect to this particular article. Now coming to the next article, this is with respect to the school enrollment, which have gone down by over 1 crore. So we have a report by the Unified District Information System for Education Plus, UDIS Plus. Now this is under the overall jurisdiction of the Department of School Education and Literacy. Now this has come up with a report which says that the total enrollment have fallen down by over 1 crore. Again, the article is data intensive, but it can give us indications with respect to the kind of regional status we have with respect to the school education. So the article says that the total enrollment of students has dropped by over 1 crore in 23-24 from that of the previous years. A total of 24.8 crore students were enrolled in the academic year 23-24, the UDIS system says. Now, over the past 4 years, the enrollment has hovered around 26 crore, so there has been a reduction. In 18-19, the total enrollment of students was 26.02 crores, which increased in 2019-20 by 1.6% and crossed 26.45 crore. An increase of more than 42 lakh students. In 22-23, there was a drop in the enrollment with 25.18 crore students being registered, and there was a further fall in 23-24 to 24.8 crores. In the total enrollment, a drop of 6%, almost 1.22 crore students as compared with 2018-19, right? Now, in 22-23, the ministry started a revitalized UDIS Plus ecosystem, which captures data on more than 60 fields for each student. To maintain the uniqueness of the child, the Aadhaar details were also collected on a voluntary basis. Now, apart from the Aadhaar, we have also a unique educational identity, EID, right? For every student has been created in the UDIS Plus portal to cover each and every child under the ecosystem. Through the creation of unique student and teacher identities, credentials of the individual students and teachers in the education ecosystem can be established more accurately, leading to the weeding out of the duplicate or ghost entries, resulting in precise identification. Now again, what we are trying to do is through the system that we are having these identities for specific students, for every particular student, so that on that basis, on that information, we can come up with more policy actions and adequately address the grievances. So we have got different schemes. For example, we have the Samagra Shiksha program, we have got the PM Poshan scheme, we have got the National Scholarship scheme. So once you have a proper data, robust data in the UDIS Plus system, that can be effectively used to transfer the benefits through these schemes. States like Bihar, Uttar Pradesh and Maharashtra saw the highest drop in the enrollment. Now, let's have a look at the UDIS Plus system. So as I said, it's a part of the Department of School Education and Literacy under the Ministry of Education. So UDIS is one of the largest management information systems initiated by the Department of School Education and Literacy. Ministry of Education, Government of India, covering more than 14.72 lakh schools, 98 lakh of teachers, and almost 24.8 crores of children. So you can have a look at this particular infographic. This is what you need to know with respect to this particular article. Now coming to the next article, we have the government asking the chartered accountants to make sure that they specify if any violation is done with respect to the provision of the Foreign Contribution Regulations Act when they are auditing the accounts of the NGOs, right? Now, why this becomes important is because, see, let's first talk about the FCRA. So we have this particular Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, which basically makes sure that the kind of contributions which are made to individuals, association or NGOs by foreign entities, they are properly regulated, right? So that these entities who are in India, these associations or individuals or NGOs, they do not work in a way which is sort of against national interest, right? So we have this particular article, we'll talk about it. Also, we'll talk about the amendment made in 2020 with respect to FCRA, one of the very important amendments. Now, the Union Home Ministry on Wednesday notified that the chartered accountants filing the audit returns of the NGOs need to specify if the organization violated the provisions of the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act 2010. The act requires the chartered accountants to certify if the association or NGO has utilized foreign contribution received for the purpose it was registered for, and the annual statement are to be uploaded on the FCRA portal. The ministry said that the CAs, the chartered accountants, will have to mention the name, email address, registration number of the auditor while issuing the audit certificate and specify if the NGO has violated the provisions of the FCRA 2010 or rules made thereunder or notifications issued thereunder, right? So again, what the government is trying to do is it's trying to hold these NGOs more accountable and make sure that they do not work against the interests of the India. Again, we have got a lot of critics who are saying that this should not be done by the government, right? The auditors will also have to specify the NGOs has not made any violation. A member of the voluntary group said that the Home Ministry notification will make it more difficult for the NGOs who are critical of the government to find auditors to file the returns on their behalf. Earlier in 21, the ministry advised the chartered accountants to ensure that the foreign funds are received and utilized by the NGOs within the four corners of the law. Again, we have a lot of reports coming from the intelligence agencies, which are definitely, which are credible, that many of these NGOs are indulging themselves in anti-national sort of activities, and therefore definitely FCRA is a kind of a regulation which is really needed. But you need to see that we need to balance the interests of these NGOs who are working for a genuine purpose and the kind of restrictions which are needed to make sure that these NGOs do not go against the national interests, right? Now, let's talk about the FCRA, enacted in 1976 and amended in 2010 and 20, regulates the acceptance and utilization of foreign contributions by individuals, associations and NGOs in India. Its primary aim is to ensure that foreign donations do not adversely impact the national interests. Now, what are the key features of the FCRA? It applies to the NGOs, registered societies, educational institutions, and individuals receiving foreign donations. Political parties, candidates, government officials, and journalists face stringent restrictions. Do remember. What is the purpose? Again, to protect the national interest, to prevent foreign influence on political, economic, religious, or social domains of the country. What are the requirements? We have the different organizations who must register with the Ministry of Home Affairs to receive the foreign contributions. What are the restrictions? Contributions must be used for only the approved purpose, such as education, health, or charitable work. Diversion of funds for unapproved purposes is prohibited. Now, what were the amendments introduced in 2020? They're important, and that's the reason I've given them. So first is the prohibition on subgranting. What it said is that let's say you have a particular NGO who has received a particular fund. Now that fund cannot be transferred to another NGO, right? So NGOs receiving foreign funds cannot transfer funds to other NGOs or entities. Reduction in the administrative expenses. What it said was that there was a cap which was placed. So it is a limit on the using foreign funds for administrative expenses, which was actually reduced from 50% to 20%. Mandatory Aadhaar for registration. All office bearers of the NGOs must provide Aadhaar number for the identity verification. Exclusive FCRA account. Now this is important. Foreign contributions must be received in designated account at the State Bank of India branch, New Delhi. Suspension period. The government can suspend the FCRA license for up to 180 days during an investigation. Compliance and reporting. More stringent reporting requirements for NGOs regarding the fund usage. Now what you must remember is that a petition was filed in the Supreme Court on questioning the kind of amendments which were made, but the Supreme Court has upheld the constitutional validity of these amendments which were made to the FCRA. That is what you need to know with respect to this particular article. Now coming to the last article of the day, this is with respect to two very important tiger reserves. One is Simlipal Tiger Reserve and the other is Tadoba-Andhari. Now again, the context of the news is that we have a particular tiger which was actually wandering in around the areas of Simlipal, but now it has been brought again back to the small enclosure of this particular tiger reserve. So the tiger was translocated from Tadoba-Andhari Tiger Reserve in Maharashtra to Simlipal Tiger Reserve on November 14 as a part of the strategy to boost the genetic diversity of the reserve big cat population. It has been a matter of concern that a significant number of tigers in the Simlipal displayed pseudo-melanism. Now what is this? You must have observed that there are certain tigers where the black strip, it is quite broad, right? So when you look at a distance, the tiger looks completely black in color, right? The strips are quite broadened. That is what pseudo-melanism is all about. Characterized by black strips that are much more pronounced than the typical coloration of the Royal Bengal tiger. And this is largely because of the inbreeding which takes place. The National Tiger Conservation Authority released these tigers in the Simlipal Tiger Reserve. Now let's talk about this particular tiger reserve. We have the Simlipal Tiger Reserve. Now this is situated in the Mayurbhanj district. Now if you just look at the map, we have the Odisha state, right? State of Odisha, and over here you have the Simlipal Tiger Reserve. Situated in the Mayurbhanj district of Odisha as a part of the Eastern Ghats, declared a tiger reserve in 1973 under the Project Tiger, named after the tree Simul tree, right, which is known as the silk cotton tree. Recognized as a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve in 2009, flora and fauna home to Bengal tigers, Asian elephants, gods, and four-horned antelopes, known for rich biodiversity including rare orchids and medicinal plants. Unique features: contains barely cultivated regions, dense forests, waterfalls, and tribal communities vulnerable due to forest fires and poaching. Forest fires are quite there in this particular area. So we have got the threats like forest fire, illegal timber smuggling, and poaching. So this is what you need to know with respect to Simlipal. Let's also talk about Tadoba-Andhari Tiger Reserve. So we have in Maharashtra, we have the district Chandrapur. Over here, we have the Tadoba-Andhari Tiger Reserve. So situated in the Chandrapur district of Maharashtra, Maharashtra's oldest and largest national park, established as a tiger reserve in 1995. Remember, oldest and largest national park. Significance: part of Project Tiger, known for high tiger density, named after the local deity Tadoba and the Andheri river, right? Flora and fauna, home to Bengal tigers, Indian leopards, sloth bears, and Indian bison. Dense forest, predominantly teak and bamboo. Now this is important. See, generally we have seen in the UPSC prelims, statements are asked that the forest is dominated by bamboo and teak trees, or in this case we have simul, right? So do remember, it can be really important. Unique features: hosts many water bodies supporting rich aquatic biodiversity, popular for wildlife safaris. Threats: again, human-wildlife conflict, encroachments, and forests, primarily in the human-wildlife conflict in the terms of the leopards, right? Many instances have been there, and forest degradation. So that is it for today. I hope you really enjoyed the session. Let us know through your likes and comments. Again, wishing you a very happy and fulfilling new year. All the best. Thank you.